Hello, everyone, and welcome to Word of Mouth. For those of you who do not know, Word of Mouth is an adult story time presented by the Julie Hampton Morgan Memorial Library. If you enjoyed today's readings and would like to watch the next program, Word of Mouth is broadcast on the first and third Thursdays of each month at 12:10 p.m. Central Time. The program is available on the Julie Hampton Morgan Facebook and YouTube page. As a reminder, this is an adult story time and may contain adult topics and language. We advise you preview material before sharing with the younger audience.
About love. The next day for lunch, delicious pies, crayfish, and lamb rissoles were served, and Nicanor the cook came upstairs during the meal to ask what the guests would like for dinner. He was an average-sized man with a chubby face and small eyes. He was clean-shaven, and it looked as if his whiskers had been plucked out rather than shaved. Aliokin said that the beautiful Pelagia was in love with this cook. Since he drank a lot and could be violent at times, she did not want to marry him. But she had agreed to live with him. He was very devout, however, and his religious convictions did not allow him to live with her. He demanded that she marry him, and he did not want it any other way. He would shout at her when he was drunk, and even hit her. She used to hide upstairs and cry when he was drunk, and Aliokin and the servants would not go out of the house during those times, so that they could protect her if necessary. The conversation turned to love. "How love is born," said Aliokin. "Why, for example, Pelagia didn't go for someone more suited to her emotionally and physically, since personal happiness is so important in love, but instead developed an attachment to Nicanor, that great pig-snout, everyone calls him pig-snout around here, is completely unknowable. And you can analyze it any way you want. Only one indisputable truth has ever been uttered about love, which is that this is a great mystery. As it says in the Bible, nothing else that has been written and uttered about love has provided any kind of answer, but merely posed a set of problems which have remained without a solution. The explanation which seems to be right for one particular set of circumstances turns out to be wrong for a dozen others, and so the best one can do, so as far as I can see, is to assess each situation on its own terms without trying to generalize. As doctors say, you should treat each case individually." "Quite true," agreed Birkin. "We respectable Russians are drawn precisely to these problems which have remained without a solution. People of other nations poeticize love or adorn it with roses and nightingales. But we Russians have to adorn love with imponderable problems, and we always pick on the most uninteresting problems too. I once had a lady friend in Moscow when I was still a student, a charming woman who was always thinking about how much money I was going to give her each month whenever I held her in my arms, or how much the current price of a pound of beef was. Well, just the same, where love is concerned, we can never stop asking ourselves questions as to whether we are being honest or not, whether we are acting wisely or stupidly, whether the relationship is going anywhere, and so forth. I don't know whether all this is a good thing or a bad thing, but I do know that it holds us back, is not rewarding, it's just a source of irritation." It seemed that he had a story he wanted to tell. People who live alone always have something or other that they want to get off their chests. Bachelors who live in towns make a point of going to the baths or to restaurants just to talk, and sometimes the stories they tell their bath attendants or waiters are very interesting. In the country, they usually end up pouring their hearts out to their house guests. Through the window could be seen gray sky and trees wet with rain. Since there was nowhere one could go in that kind of weather, there was nothing else to do but tell stories and listen. "I've been living and working on the land in Sofia for a long time now," began Aliokin, "since I left the university, in fact. My upbringing was not conducive to physical work, and my natural inclinations are towards books and papers. But when I came here, the estate was saddled with debts, and since my father had taken out loans partly because he had spent so much money on my education, I decided I would not leave. I'd stay and work until I'd paid off the debt. I made my decision and started to work here, although not, I have to admit, without a certain amount of dread. The land around here does not yield very much. And in order for the farming not to make a loss, you need to use slave labor or take on casual workers, which amounts pretty much to the same thing. Otherwise, you have to put everything on a peasant footing, which means you and your family working in the fields yourselves. There is nothing in between, but back then I did not go for such fine distinctions. I didn't leave a single patch of earth untouched. I rounded up all the men and women laborers from the neighboring villages and got them working like crazy. I also threw myself into the plowing and the sowing and the reaping, but I found it very tedious and frowned with disdain like the village cat, which finally gets so hungry he ends up eating the cucumbers in the vegetable patch. My body ached and I used to fall asleep on the job. At first, I was under the impression that I could easily accommodate my cultural pursuits to this kind of working life, and I thought all I would need would be to maintain a certain amount of discipline. So I sat up home in the smart rooms here upstairs, arranged to have coffee and liqueurs served after lunch and dinner, and then I went to bed. And when I went to bed, I used to read The Messenger of Europe into the early hours. But our priest father, Ivan, came over one day and drank all my bottles of liquor in one sitting, and then my Messengers of Europe started ending up with his daughters because in the summer, especially when we were haymaking, I would not even manage to make it to my own bed and used to fall asleep in the sleigh in the barn or in some forest hut. What reading was I going to do? I gradually ended up moving downstairs and eating in the servants' kitchen, and the only remnants of my former luxurious lifestyle are all the people here who used to work for my father, and I find it too painful to let them go. During my first few years here, I was elected to serve as an honorary justice of peace. Every now and then I would have to go into town and take part in the sessions at the assizes and at the regional court, and it kept me amused. After we had lived here for 2 or 3 months on end, especially during the winter time, you end up beginning to miss seeing black frock coats. And it wasn't just black frock coats you could see at the circuit court, but uniforms and tailcoats. These were all lawyers, people who had been educated. There was always someone to talk to. After sleeping on the sleigh and sitting in the servants' kitchen, it was such a luxury to sit in an armchair wearing a clean shirt and ankle boots with a chain around your neck. People in the town received me warmly, and I was keen to get to know them. Of all the acquaintances I made, the most lasting and also the most pleasant, to be honest, was my colleague Luganovic, the president of the circuit court. You both know him. He's an absolutely charming man. It was just after that famous arson case. The cross-examination went on for 2 days, and we were exhausted. Luganovic looked at me and said, "Look, why don't you come over for dinner?" It was unexpected because I barely knew Luganovic. Our relationship had been purely formal up to that point, and I never had been to his home. I nipped back to my hotel room to change and set up for dinner. And that's when I had the opportunity to get to know Anna Alexeyevna, Luganovic's wife. She was still very young then, no more than 22, and her first child had been born 6 months earlier. It's all in the past, and so I would find it hard now to define what exactly was so unusual about her and what I liked so much about her. But back then at the dinner, it was crystal clear. I saw a young woman, a beautiful, kind, intelligent, charming woman who was unlike anyone I had ever met before. I immediately felt she was a kindred spirit, someone I already knew, as if I had seen her face in those warm, intelligent eyes back in my childhood in the album which lay on my mother's dresser. In the arson case, 4 Jews had been accused of forming a conspiracy, but totally falsely in my opinion. I got very worked up at the dinner because I felt so miserable about it, and I can't for the life of me remember what I said, but Anna Alexeyevna kept shaking her head and saying to her husband, "Dmitri, how on earth could this have happened?" Luganovic is a good-natured sort and one of those straightforward kind of people who strongly believe that if a person is brought to court, he must therefore be guilty, and that expressing doubt in the correctness of the sentence can only be done in a legal manner on paper, but certainly not over dinner, nor in private conversation. "Neither you nor I started the fire," he said gently, "and that's why they haven't taken us to court and sent us to prison." Both husband and wife pressed me to eat and drink more from very small details, such as the way they made their coffee together, for example, and the way they understood each other without finishing their sentences. I could see that they had a peaceful, happy relationship, and that they were glad to have a guest. After dinner, we played duets on the piano. Then it began to grow dark, and I went home. This was the beginning of spring. Then I spent the whole of the summer at Safino without once leaving, and I had no time even to think about the town. But the memory of the slender, fair-haired woman remained with me all those days. I didn't think about her, but it was as if her graceful shadow lay across my soul. In late autumn, there was a charity performance in town. When I went to the governor's box, I had been invited to stop by in the interval. Who should I see but Anna Alexeyevna with the governor's wife? And I was struck once again by the same impression of irresistible, dazzling beauty and kind, gentle eyes, and again a feeling of intimacy. We sat next to each other and then went into the foyer. "You've lost weight," she said. "Have you been ill?" "Yes, I have a problem with my shoulder, and I sleep badly when it rains." "You look run down. When you came to dinner in the spring, you seemed younger and in brighter spirits. You were inspired that evening and talked a great deal. What you said was very interesting, and I have to confess that I even became a little carried away by you. For some reason, you came into my mind quite often during the summer months, and today, when I was getting ready to come to the theater, I just had a feeling I would see you." And she started laughing. "But you look run down today," she said again. "It makes you look older." I had lunch with the Luganoviches the next day. Then after lunch, they went off into the dacha to get everything ready there for winter. And I went with them. I returned to town with them too, and at midnight sat drinking tea with them in their peaceful family home, with a fire blazing and a young mother constantly going out to check whether her little girl was asleep. After that, I would go and visit the Luganoviches whenever I went to town. They got used to me, and I got used to them. I would usually turn up without any advance notice, as if I was one of the family. "Who is it?" From a far-off room would come that littling voice I found so lovely. "It's Pavel Konstantinovitch," the maid or the nanny would answer. Anna Alexeyevna would come to greet me with a concerned expression and would ask every time, "Why have you been so long? Has something happened?" The look of her eyes, the refined, elegant hand she held out to me, the dress she wore at home, her hairstyle, her voice, and the way she walked always gave me the impression of something new, unusual, and important in my life. We would talk for ages and be silent for ages, each thinking our own thoughts. Or else she would play the piano for me if no one was at home. I would stay and wait, talking to the nanny and playing with the baby, or I would go and lie down on the ottoman in the study and read the newspaper. When Anna Alexeyevna returned, I would go and greet her in the hall, take her parcels from her, and for some reason I would always carry those parcels with much love and solemnity as if I was a little boy. There is a saying, "The woman with no cares had no cares, so she bought a pig." The Luganoviches had no worries, so they made friends with me. If I did not come to town for a long time, it meant I was ill or something bad had happened to me, and they both began to worry a great deal. They worried that instead of engaging in academic or literary work, here I was, an educated man who knew 4 languages, living in the countryside, running round and round like a hamster in a wheel, working fiendishly hard but never making any money. They thought I wasn't happy, and that if I talked and laughed and ate, then it was only to cover up my unhappiness. I felt their anxious eyes on me, even in the more light-hearted moments when I was in a good mood. Their concern was particularly touching when I really was going through a tough time, when some creditor was hounding me or there was not enough money to pay an urgent bill. Both of them, husband and wife, would whisper by the window. Then he would come up to me and say with a serious expression, "If you need money at the moment, Pavel Konstantinovitch, then my wife and I hope you won't feel shy about borrowing from us." And his ears would turn red with embarrassment. And sometimes after they had whispered by the window in just the same way, he would come up to me with his red airs and say, "My wife and I would sincerely like you to accept this gift." And he would give me cufflinks, a cigarette case, or a lamp, and in return I would send him from the country some slaughtered fowl, butter, and flowers. They were both very wealthy, by the way. In the early days I often took out loans and was not particularly fussy about where I obtained them from. Anywhere would do. But nothing in the world would have induced me to borrow from the Luganoviches, the very idea. I was unhappy. I thought about her at home, out in the fields and in the barn, and I tried to unravel the mystery of how a young, beautiful, clever woman could marry an uninteresting man in the brink of old age, her husband was over 40, and have children with them. I also tried to unravel the mystery of this boring, good-natured, simple soul who thought in such a boring, sensible way, who was only ever socialized with wealthy people at balls and parties, who was superfluous and inert, who wore a submissive and detached expression as if he had been put up for sale, but who believed, however, in his right to be happy and have children with her. I kept trying to understand why she had to meet him of all people rather than me, and why such a dreadful mistake should have taken place in our lives. Each time I came into town, I could see from her eyes that she had been expecting me, and she herself would confess that she had felt something special all day, and had guessed that I was going to come. We would talk for a long time and be silent for a long time, but we never confessed our love to each other, always hiding it shyly and jealously. We were frightened of everything that might betray our secret to each other. My love was tender and deep, but I tried to be rational, and wondered what might happen to our love if we didn't have the strength to contain it. It seemed impossible that my quiet side love could suddenly, crudely destroy the happy flow of life of her husband, her children, and the whole household. Where everyone was so fond of me and trusted me, would it be honest? She would have gone with me, but where would we go? Where could I take her? It would have been different if my life had been glamorous and interesting. If I had been fighting for the liberation of my country, for example, or was a famous scholar, an actor, or an artist. But I would just be taking her from one tedious, ordinary way of life to another one exactly the same, or one that was even more tedious. And how long would our love last? What would happen if I got ill, or died, or we simply stopped loving each other? She had clearly thought about everything in a similar way. She thought about her husband, about her children, and about her mother, who loved her husband like a son. If she gave in to her feelings, she would have to lie or tell the truth, and both options seemed equally terrible and awkward in her position, and she was tormented by the question of whether her love would bring me happiness and whether it would only complicate my life, which was already difficult and full of misfortune. She felt that she was not young enough for me, and not hard-working or dynamic enough to begin a new life. And she often told her husband that I should get married to an intelligent, reliable girl who would be a good housewife and helper to me, immediately adding that it would be practically impossible to find anyone like that in the town. Meanwhile, the years went by. Anna Alexeyevna now had 2 children. When I arrived at the Luganoviches, the maid would smile warmly. The children would shout that their Uncle Pavel Konstantinovich had come and would throw themselves round my neck. Everyone was glad to see me. They did not understand what was going on in my heart, and they thought I was glad too. Everyone saw me as a noble being. Both the adults and children in the household felt that a noble being had entered their house when I arrived, and this added a particular charm to their relationship with me. It was as if their lives became somehow purer and more beautiful in my presence. Anna Alexeyevna and I would go to the theater, always on foot. We would sit next to each other with our shoulders touching, and I would silently take the opera glasses from her hands and feel during that time that she was close to me, that she was mine, and that we could not live without each other, but through some misunderstanding we would always say goodbye and part like strangers whenever we left the theater. Goodness knows what people in town were saying about us, but there was never a grain of truth in anything they said. In the last years, Anna Alexeyevna started to go to visit either her mother or her sister more often. She was in a bad state by this time. There were times when she felt dissatisfied and thought that her life was ruined, when she did not want to see either her husband or her children. She began to be treated for her nerves. We continued tight-lipped to maintain our silence, and when others were present, she started to experience a strange irritation with me. Whatever I said, she would disagree with, and if I got into an argument, she would always side with whoever I was arguing with. Whenever I dropped something, she would say coldly, "Well done." If I forgot the opera glasses when we were going to the theater, she would say, "I knew you would forget them." Luckily or unluckily, there is nothing in our lives which does not come to an end sooner or later. The time for separation came when Luganovich was appointed to be judge in one of the western provinces. They had to sell their furniture, their horses, and their dacha. We were all sad on the day we went out to the dacha. I looked around one last time at the garden and the garden roof before returning home, and I realized that the time had come to part not just with the dacha. It was decided that at the end of August we would send Anna Alexeyevna off on her journey to the Crimea, where her doctors were sending her, and then a little while later the children would accompany Leganevich to his western province. A great crowd of us went to see Anna Alexeyevna off. When she had already said goodbye to her husband and her children, and there was a minute left before they rang the third bell, I ran into her carriage to put on the rack a basket she had almost left behind, and then we had to say goodbye. As soon as our eyes met while we were standing there in the compartment, our emotional strength left us, and I embraced her. She pressed her face to my chest, and tears ran down her face as I kissed her face and shoulders, and her hands, which were wet with tears. Oh, we were so unhappy. I confessed my love for her, and with a burning pain in my heart, I realized how unnecessary, petty, and deceptive everything which had got in the way of our love had been. I realized that when you love someone, your reasoning about that love should be based on what is supreme, on what is more important than happiness or unhappiness, sin or virtue, the way that they are usually understood. Otherwise, it's not worth reasoning at all. I kissed her for the last time, shook her hand, and we parted forever. The train was already moving. I went and sat in the next compartment. It was empty, and I sat there and cried until we got to the next station. Then I went back home to Sofia on foot. While Aliokin had been talking, the rain had stopped, and the sun had come out. Birkin and Ivan Ivanovich went to the balcony. From there was a wonderful view onto the garden and the river, which was now gleaming in the sun like a mirror. They enjoyed the view, but they also felt sad that this man with the kind, intelligent eyes, who had told them such a heartfelt story, really was just going round and round here on this huge estate, like a hamster in a wheel, instead of being engaged in scholarship or something else, which would have made his life more enjoyable. And they thought about how sorrowful the young lady must have looked when he was saying goodbye to her in the train, and was kissing her face and shoulders. They had both met her in town from time to time. Birkin was even acquainted with her, and thought she was beautiful.